Hi guys. Before we proceed to this video, we've got something very important to share with you. Neoliberalism, Inequality and Authoritarianism by Professor John V. Kofis is available for purchase. You can order it directly from the publisher Little French eBooks or through Amazon.
Hello everyone, welcome. This is an analytical session about the institutional erosion of the United States against the background of especially of the election on June 14, 2025 of Zoran Mandani, who was born in Africa of Indian parents, grew up in New York City, became a representative for the New York State House, Assemblyman for the District of Queens. Of course, New York has 5 boroughs. The election of this young man, 33 years old, a charismatic young man indeed, has stirred enormous controversy, not just in New York City, because the mainstream media never paid much attention to him and actually had written him off against the background of a rival who was a seasoned politician of the Democratic establishment supported by Wall Street and the Democratic Party, namely Andrew Cuomo, a former governor. However, the rival has a record that is stained, ridden with scandals. And of course, the results were that the unexpected happened, namely the 33-year-old young man who was born in Africa of Indian parents and is a Muslim, won a city where 12% of the population is actually Jewish. And in fact, many argue that the largest Jewish population outside of Tel Aviv is in New York City. Now, the question here that most, and there has been a lot written about Mamdani, is whether he is the issue or there is an institutional crisis. There is a legitimacy of the institutional structure in America, which is both in the public sector and the private sector. Let us assume that this young man never existed. The problems, the systemic problems of America would still be prevalent. They would still be there. What gave rise to an unlikely political hero of the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, let's not forget that this young man was endorsed by Bernie Sanders, who, by the way, is Jewish, because a lot has been made about Mamdani as a Muslim who is in favor of universal human rights and opposes the genocide that Israel has been carrying out in Gaza. But actually, a number of Jews, New York Jews, voted for Mamdani, and he was endorsed by Bernie Sanders, another New Deal Democrat, as well as Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, namely Bernie Sanders' protege. And he carried the majority of the vote and is very likely to win the general election. The question, of course, as I said, is not this individual. This individual emerged in the political arena of New York City because of the conditions in that city specifically, but also throughout the nation, against the background, by the way, I want to emphasize this. Today's July 5th. Yesterday was the 4th of July, which is American Independence Day. And yesterday, the Trump administration celebrated the passage of the big, beautiful bill, namely $4.5 trillion in givebacks, mostly in givebacks, to the richest 5% of Americans. And it is this type of policy, public policy, that has widened the gap in American society, socioeconomically and sociopolitically, from the Reagan administration to the present under the neoliberal model, that gave rise to someone like Mamdani. And if it were not Mamdani, it would be somebody else, eventually. And the reaction of the establishment, both in the Democratic Party and in the Republican Party, was how dare New York elects an individual who is foreign born, born in Africa, by the way, of Indian parents, and he's a Muslim, and he's an advocate of actually Keynesian policies, although the stigma that the critics have attached to him, because he's a member of the Democratic Socialists of America, is that he's a communist, he's a socialist, he wants to bring communism to America. They're panicking, and the reason they're panicking, really, I must admit, because I'm a structuralist analyst, I don't believe in the cult of personality as much as the cult of personality is promoted in the modern political arena, not just in the US, but across the world. There are structural problems. We have a country that is in serious trouble in terms of an economic downturn under the neoliberal model. And as many scholars have noted, the crisis is in the neoliberal model, and that is combined with the forever war doctrine, which both political parties embrace and use military solutions to solve diplomatic crisis on a world scale and pursue destabilization policies, whether in the Middle East, in the South China Sea, in Eastern Europe. That combination has been extremely costly, combined with a corporate welfare model of neoliberalism, where massive amounts of money, we just witnessed the latest bill, 4.5 trillion, massive amounts of money transferring from social welfare programs, specifically Medicaid, as all Democrats agree, gutting Medicaid, taking money from the healthcare system that serves the poorest Americans and pouring it into the pockets of the 5% who are the richest Americans. That's the general background against which Mamdani won. That's the background. And we have something else here. In New York City, and I'll give you the statistics, the situation is much worse than the nation as a whole. New York City is one of the most expensive cities to live in the United States. It's among the top five most expensive cities in the United States to live in. And this young man is advocating making life. It's very simple. The message was very simple. That's why he connected. It's not a generation. We'll talk about generational issues, ethnic issues, religious, and the issue of race and so forth. Let me, since I mentioned the issue of race, the latest controversy with Mamdani. Yesterday, the New York Times broke a story. One never knows what to make of the New York Times, but they broke a story from hacked material from the computers of Columbia University that Mamdani, as a young college student, identified. Remember, he was born in Africa, Indian parents, grew up in New York City. In the college application, he identified as African American or Black. I was in higher education for more than 3 decades, and I was on many committees, including the scholarship committee, and of course the students, even if they have any connection to a minority, they know that there are scholarships set aside that they can take advantage of. That's one issue. The other issue is entrance into the university, and we screened those applications, and we could tell. But the fact that that system exists, and like I said, I was in higher education and I witnessed this, and some of my colleagues and I were lamenting that this system even exists, that there should be, such a system. This is indicative of systematic and institutionalized racism embedded into the system for decades. So to the degree that there had to be affirmative action, that's what this issue is about. Now, not to mention the fact that the very critics of Mamdani identifying the way he did on the college application, which, by the way, he never, even the New York Times had to admit that he never said that he was African American or Black. But the critics, when you look at who the critics are, they themselves are very critical of critical race theory. They castigate critical race theory. And in fact, some of those critics, there's one, in fact, that has been identified. I don't know if it was Newsweek or one of the other major news organizations. They discovered that one of these critics of Mamdani, criticizing Mamdani for identifying the way he did, is a eugenics apologist. Eugenics, by the way, is an ancient Greek word which implies that you believe in white supremacy, you believe in the supremacy, genetic supremacy. In other words, there's no universal, there is no embracing of universal human rights and universal equality. So the white supremacists, some of the people who are in fact critical of critical race theory, okay, are the ones who are castigating Mamdani. Okay, so it's not the Black leadership. Obviously, Eric Adams, who is the mayor of New York, and behind him Wall Street, of course, and Donald Trump. But if you put those people aside, the fact is that it's not Hispanics. In fact, Congress people and some of the Black leadership came out immediately and defended Mamdani and argued that an individual in America, such as it is, immersed in identity politics of division because of the history of slavery and segregation, okay, this is the situation we have. To the degree, like I said, I was in higher education, we screened applications. And of course, students try to cut corners and see, well, can I get a scholarship here? Can I get entry into this university there? But if they even had a remote connection to something, they would use it. And that's what the system provided for them. Now, I believe that we have a systemic problem in America, and it's not unique to New York. Immediately, a lot of right-wing, but also Democratic establishment critics of Mamdani, who is nothing more than a New Deal Democrat, no different than AOC and Bernie Sanders. It's just that he happens to be Muslim and from Indian parents. But other than that, he fits into the mold. He's a product of American culture, of the left, of the Democratic Party. And the results, because there have been published results on the demographics of who voted for him, and we'll talk about that. And when you break that down, you see that the support is from the white middle class primarily. And the question is, why is the middle class, the white middle class in New York City of all places, why is the white middle class voting for this person if he's such a menacing presence in the political arena? Why are they doing that? Including, by the way, even Geraldo de Vera came out in one of these programs, one of these nonsense polemics programs, talk show programs. And he said, well, even my own children, he's part Jewish. And he said, I know a lot of Jewish kids in New York. The parents vote conservative and pro-Israel. They don't care about the genocide, but their children don't. They vote progressive. So you have a problem here, and the problem is institutional. The institutional legitimacy in the United States is in crisis. And what has led to this crisis, as scholarly literature points out, is the neoliberal system combined with military Keynesianism, that is this forever war, raising defense spending. As we saw, Trump went to Europe to the NATO meeting in Holland and demanded that they raise defense spending from 3% to 5% of GDP, and they did, okay? And immediately the reaction in some of the independent and center-left newspapers in Europe was, where is this money going to come from? The civilian economy. This is the same case in the United States. The United States spends about a third of the world. When you look at world spending on defense, the U.S. spends about a third of it, between 25 and 30% of it. So you have enormous amounts of money being absorbed. And now under this new bill that was just passed, and yesterday, July 4th, President Trump celebrated the big, beautiful bill, accepted that the beautiful, that big, beautiful bill is draining resources from the working class and the middle class, that same middle class that voted for Mamdani in New York City, by the way, and they know it, and is pouring it into the pockets of billionaires and millionaires who don't need it. A few of them have said so. They're honest enough to have said so. And the gap between rich and poor is continuing across the United States, which has a higher poverty level than China, which it criticizes. When you look at the poverty level of the United States versus China in 1990, and then when you look at it today, it is astonishing where China started from in 1990 and what it is today, 35 years later. The US has a 12% poverty rate. New York City, where Mamdani won, has 25% poverty rate. 1 out of 4 people in New York City is at or below poverty. That's the background against which Mamdani won. And yet, when you break down the demographics, it's interesting that the middle class ran to Mamdani. They voted for him because they fear that the neoliberal oligarchy is compressing them, it's forcing them down. And they ran to a progressive who happens to be Muslim and happens to have Indian parents, but is an otherwise product of American culture, by the way, because that young man grew up in New York City and he was molded into the American political system, okay? Left-wing Democratic Party politics. I want to point out that the institutional crisis in America has manifested itself, as public opinion polls indicate, because yesterday, I'm mentioning this because yesterday was July 4th, and there was a public opinion poll, and this institutional crisis is manifesting itself in so many areas, it's unbelievable. And in the public opinion poll, interestingly enough, there is a huge rise in the number of Americans in the opinion poll who are voted Democrat in 2015, voting Democrat today, 10 years later, who call themselves proud Americans. There is only about 1/3 of them that claim they're proud to be Americans. This is an indication, not that they hate their country, not that they don't love their country, of course they do, that they are disillusioned with the institutional structure which brought about the need for someone like Mamdani. If it weren't him, it would be, like I said, it would be somebody else like him, a progressive. When you have, and this is on a national level, this is not in New York City. This is because a lot of right-wing critics and Democrats alike, by the way, argue, well, this is just an aberration. What happened in New York City on June 14 is just an aberration. It's just New York City, because New York, they rejected Andrew Cuomo because he had sex scandals and other scandals and so forth, corruption and so forth. And they rejected him. Okay. Well, there were other candidates on the slate. In fact, there was a Jewish candidate, Brad Landers, who also, by the way, is progressive and also has an agenda not that different from the agenda of Zoran Mandani. So you have here an institutional crisis when you have about 1/3 of Democrats saying, well, I'm proud to be an American. The rest are not. And it's not that they don't, like I said, it is that they have lost faith in the legitimacy of their institutions. That is, they don't believe those institutions are designed to be faithful to the social contract of America, that is, serve the entire population, not just the richest 5% who just happen, by coincidence, this July 4th, to be the recipients officially, after Trump signed the bill, of trillions in givebacks, in tax lowering their taxes, on top of corporate welfare subsidies that they already receive. So that's the situation that we have. I want to mention, by the way, that in the United States, this is not just New York, that in the United States, the institutional crisis is manifesting itself in ways that, and this is another reason Mamdani won, and that the middle class, the white middle class, when you look at demographics, it's not so much blacks and Hispanics. Asians, of course, by and large, voted for Mamdani. He's Asian. But the white middle class is what carried him to victory. Another thing they're concerned about is the erosion of democracy, which is another sign of the institutional crisis of America. In this new big, beautiful bill, there is massive amount of money. Okay. The anti-Mamdani media in the United States, which is the mainstream media, by the way, agrees that this big, beautiful bill pours enormous amounts of money into two areas that frightens a lot of people for a lot of different reasons. The area of police, strengthening the police state, using ICE, the immigration service, by the way, to go after undocumented workers, okay, using the front of illegal migrants as though they are the enemy of the United States. They're workers. In fact, there was I forget which business magazine I read it yesterday, there was an interesting article. A lot of companies, especially in the farm sector, agribusiness, are beginning to feel the pinch because, especially out in the Western states, because many of the so-called undocumented workers are in hiding from immigration agents. And what we're going to see is a rise in an increase in prices in produce, in fruits, but in other sectors, in meat packing and so forth, because that's what they work. They do. They work. They don't steal money. They're not criminals. Even White House memos that were obtained, that were leaked, another leak to the press a few weeks ago, when the Trump administration sent ICE agents out in the National Guard out in Los Angeles County to go after workers, school children, and so forth. That memo revealed that inside the White House they were frustrated that there were not that many illegal criminals, so they had to go after just common workers, just arrest the workers. A lady cleaning hotel rooms at one of the big corporate hotel chains, arrest her. Okay, someone picking lettuce in the fields or onions and so forth in the onion fields in California. Okay, fine. That means that the cost of the product and service is going to go higher. This is, of course, an attack. This is a distraction that the real enemy is not Wall Street, that is amassing these huge profits and which is getting corporate welfare subsidies for everything from bailouts to these massive tax breaks in the trillions of dollars at the cost of the taxpayer. But it's migrants who work for a living, okay, and their children. That's who's at fault for all the calamities that befall America. It's migrants. If they only disappeared, America would be Shangri-La. This is a deliberate campaign to distract from the crisis of neoliberalism. However, in New York City, the white middle class, not just the white, but all the voters who voted for Mamdani and for Brad Landers, by the way, realize that there is an institutional crisis and there is a lack of legitimacy, and the public opinion polls of only 1/3 of Democrats polled agree that they're proud to be Americans is indicative of that, right? This is not an issue about a young man who happens to be Muslim of Indian parents. That's nonsense. Could have been anybody. Okay, they use all sorts of arguments against Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who is also obviously representing New York District, and Bernie Sanders and other progressive politicians. So this is not new. Now, I want to give you some statistics about how real conditions in New York brought the young man Mamdani to the forefront of the political arena. There are 66 billionaires in New York City and 384 500 millionaires in a city of 8.3 million people. These 308, let's say 385,000, let's round it off, 385,000 millionaires and billionaires, there are only 66 billionaires, own 3 trillion of the wealth in New York City. In New York City, the average living wage is 137,000 when the cost of living, it's 124,000 for an individual and 137,000 for a family. The cost of living for a family of 4 in New York to be above poverty, in other words, mom, dad, and 2 children, is 307,000. What we have in New York City is a situation where they don't have they're way below this. 25% of the population, that is 1 out of 4. Remember, the population is more than 2 million people. Population is 8.3 million. 1 out of 4 is below poverty. 420,000 children are below poverty in New York City. The poverty level in the United States is between 11 and 12%. Okay. In New York City, it's 25%. Interestingly enough, when the demographics came out about who really voted for this Mamdani character, it wasn't so much the working class. He got some working class votes, and after the election, of course, some trade unions flocked to him because they realized he's going to win. So, but it was really the middle class, because they're afraid. They look at these statistics and they are afraid that this is the next. Fear and anxiety about the future, the institutional structure drove them to this. Now, there is something else that's very interesting about New York City. I had to look this up because I was wondering, why is it that this Mamdani character, that everybody dismissed, he's inexperienced, he doesn't know, the mainstream, everybody meaning the mainstream press and billionaires coming out strongly against him, denouncing him for everything from his college application as a young man. And like I said, I was in university committees where we screened applications. It's not uncommon to see people cutting corners in applications. Anyway, this is not to excuse, by the way, even this is not to excuse to encourage not being forthcoming in college applications or any kind of application. But the fact is that this is a distraction. This is not the issue. The issue here is the systemic crisis in the United States, and especially in New York City, one of the costliest cities. People who have visited, by the way, know, even if you don't live there, when you visit, the cost of living is very high. Anyway, this is a city where the billionaires and the millionaires are taxed at 11%. I had to do some research and find out what is the tax rate in London, Paris, Frankfurt, okay, Tokyo, Beijing. In fact, in major cities, it's averaging 45%, 11% in New York. On top of billions of dollars that the state and the city offer in corporate subsidies, which the derivative effects go to investors, mostly millionaires and billionaires. On top of that, they pay 11% on average versus 45% in major cities around the world. And yet they had the audacity, the critics, both Democrats and Republicans, he wants what? He wants to freeze rents. Mamdani wants to offer children free lunches and free childcare, and he wants free bus rides. Because as Mamdani said, and everybody who, not just in New York, any major city, who rides buses? The working class. If you are wealthy, you have a car, you take your car. That's just the reality, whether it's in London or in New York. And he said, well, let's just make it free. And then, well, how's he going to finance this? Never do they ask, why is it that the New York taxpayer, the working class and the middle class, is subsidizing for years the billionaire class, as Bernie Sanders points out, and the multimillionaires, these 385,000 people? Why is this oligarchy, to use Bernie Sanders' terms, why is this oligarchy being subsidized at the expense of society, not just in New York City, all across America, by the way, And no one is raising an eyebrow. Why is it that no one is raising an eyebrow? No one on the side of the establishment. No one is raising an eyebrow that the big, beautiful bill that was just passed, 4.5 trillion, is creating both a greater gap between rich and poor, pushing the middle class and the working class down, okay, creating more poverty. So they're going to kick off at least 1 million people, probably more, of Medicaid, by the way, which is for the poor. But nobody cares. They don't care when money is transferred. That is, they, the establishment, doesn't care when the money is transferred from the working class and the middle class pockets into the billionaires and millionaires, but they care if, as Mamdani pointed out, let's have a 2% tax on these rich people to pay for all this, to pay for these social programs. Is this a radical idea? Absolutely not. This is exactly, and it's very modest, by the way, what the Franklin Roosevelt administration did during the Great Depression, based on Keynesian economics, to stimulate employment and to stimulate spending, so the economy would be stabilized. And let me point out, by the way, that even during the Eisenhower, let's forget Roosevelt, because a lot of people are so misguided, they do not realize that the Roosevelt New Deal policies were based on the political philosophy of John Maynard Keynes, who was anti-Marxist. He, in fact, strengthened the capitalist system by introducing policies that stabilize the economy, not just in the United States under FDR, by the way, but globally, because other versions of this were adopted globally. Okay, he was not a Marxist. Capitalism was saved by Keynesian economics. This young man is proposing similar policies, and very modest, because even during the Eisenhower administration, who was a Republican in the 1950s, big business, corporations, and the rich paid up to 74% tax rate, not an effective tax rate of 11% today. And some of them, by the way, tax loopholes and tax havens around the world, as we know, as the Panama Papers and so forth, they have revealed, are constantly engaged in tax evasion, tax avoidance. But yet the representatives of these same people, and some of these same people, these Wall Street billionaires, come out and go, how come he wants to take the privileged status of my billionaire position here in society? Which reminds me, by the way, the first Supreme Court Justice, John Jay, New York, of course, New Yorker, stated, well, the people who have money should run society. Well, that's exactly what's happening. This is the people who have money are running society. They're running the institutions. And the people are sending a message. In the Mamdani election, on June 14, 2025, the New York middle class, primarily some workers, Asian Americans, Latinos, sent a message. And the message was, we don't believe that this institutional structure is faithful to the social contract. There's a legitimacy crisis here. So what did they do? They go for a reformist, not a revolutionary, by the way. The system still remains neoliberal capitalist. This man is actually trying to save it from self-destruction, because the way it's going, Trump introduces in 2017 close to 2 trillion in tax givebacks to the rich, sends the public debt skyrocketing. Now this, and everyone who is worth their economics degree in college and has written about this, points out this will only add trillions to the public debt. So they're printing money, lowering the value. By the way, since Trump, 10% of the US dollar has lost 10% of its value since he took over. In 6 months, the dollar lost 10% of its value. Combined with the instability of this insane economic nationalist policies where tariffs are at the forefront, off again, on again, off again, on again, this tariff war. Canada is the enemy, China is the enemy, everybody's the enemy. This has also increased the US trade deficit, the opposite effect of what the so-called tariffs are supposed to do, by the way. When I looked at the statistics in preparation for this session, I wasn't surprised that this was happening, because what companies do is, in anticipation of what this man is doing in the public policy that he's following with regard to tariffs, they figure, well, we'll add more stock. So they import more to beat the tariff increases that he imposes in other countries. So this kind of instability. Now, clearly, speculators are making money. People who are speculating in the market are making money. And those people are behind Trump. And even if there are those who lose, they still can't say who lose in the market among capitalists, because capitalists are not homogeneous. There are people, Warren Buffett, for example, clearly is very different than some of the right-wing forever war billionaires who support Trump. But all of them know that they benefit from a Trump administration that is constantly strengthening big capital. This big, beautiful bill that the president celebrated on July 4th, Independence Day. That means more money in the pockets of the richest 5%, whether they're in favor of his policies or not. They benefit. So they tend to be quiet. There are all kinds of, there's been some literature, by the way, some articles about this, why CEOs are timid about saying anything critical of Trump. Not that he has any difficulty going after them, including Elon Musk, by the way, who found out the hard way when he tried to use his money as leverage against those who would support the big, beautiful bill. Trump threatened to deport him back to South Africa, denaturalize, take his citizenship away. So you have this kind of environment, which doesn't sit well with a lot of people in the United States, not just in New York City, by the way, but across America. These are systemic problems, not unique to New York City. These are problems of the entire country. The institutional structure in New York City is not very different from that of California, by the way. California has obviously the largest economy. California also a democratic state, just like New York. It has a different set of problems, different set of assets. Again, a different situation. But systemically, this is one capitalist economy linked to the world capitalist economy, and part of the same elite structure, the socioeconomic structure, where the elites behind the political class, both Democrats and Republicans. This is not about Republicans. I want to make sure I get this point across. This is about the institutional structure, which is the uniparty system. The uniparty meaning one party, both Democrats and Republicans establishment, really are adamantly against this man who won the primary in New York. And what do they fear? They don't fear him. Although they have threatened to deport him, deprive his citizenship, they have threatened all sorts of things. They're trying to find everything they can about him to do what? Delegitimize his voter base which knows that the problem of legitimacy doesn't rest with Mamdani, but it rests with institutional structure. It rests with decadent elites in America. Mamdani wasn't even born when neoliberalism was created, and it began this rising gap between rich and poor. He wasn't even around when we had a huge rise, a trend in rise in militarism, although the Cold War had ended. The war against terror, the invasion of Afghanistan, the invasion of Iraq, supporting the proxy war in Ukraine. For that he was around. The genocide in Israel. This is Mamdani didn't create. These are structural problems for which the establishment uniparty, the Democrats and the Republicans, behind which is Wall Street, okay, and the richest 5%, which mostly support these two parties, by the way, they give money to both of them. That is where the problem rests. Now, the elites in America have panicked. They have panicked because Mamdani represents New Deal politics. Mamdani represents, like AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and Bernie Sanders. They represent the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. And the progressive wing wants social justice and human rights to be respected. And they want to water down neoliberalism. Mamdani cannot undo the capitalist economy of the United States in New York City. New York City operates within the larger capitalist world system, and it is an integral part of that. All he wants to do is pain relief for the working class, pain relief. With regard to housing, which is very expensive in New York City. Everyone who has studied or has been to New York knows this. This is a reality that New Yorkers know. And even those who visit New York City know or have studied about New York City know. The cost of living is very high. You don't have 1 out of 4 below poverty in a city like New York unless there was massive capital concentration and appropriation by the rich. He wants to address that the way that it was addressed from Franklin Roosevelt, to Eisenhower, who had far higher taxes. General Eisenhower was a Republican, far higher taxes than the Democrats and the Republicans of today, by the way. And Mamdani wants a mere 2%. Let's just give them something, right? In other words, a reformist. Now, the crisis of the institutional crisis is manifesting itself from the adamant opposition, and some of it very vicious, by the way, and very personal. But as a historian, I have to tell you that this is exactly the sort of thing that we should expect when there was resistance to plutocracy, an ancient Greek word which means rule by the rich. From the late 19th century, the so-called Gilded Age, which Trump calls, of course, the Golden Age, there was at the local level, from Wisconsin to New York, a trend of resisting plutocracy. And during the 1890s and then early 1900s, there were progressive mayors and progressive governors that were elected. And in New York City, during the FDR era, a progressive called Fiorello LaGuardia, many people may be familiar with LaGuardia Airport, named after this politician. The mayor was elected in 1934 and he stayed until 1946. LaGuardia is used today by some analysts as a model for what Mamdani can do. In my view, wrongly so, and I'll tell you why. I hope that Mamdani is as successful as Mayor LaGuardia. However, LaGuardia came in at a different time. He came in at roughly at the same time as Roosevelt, whom he knew. By the way, the Roosevelt family the Roosevelts from New York. Both he and his wife were New Yorkers. And FDR wholeheartedly supported LaGuardia and supported his programs. And in fact, he was a New Yorker, he supported New York City with all sorts of monies and programs. Again, taxing the surplus capital that existed out there, absorbing some of the surplus capital from the rich to strengthen and stabilize the economy in accordance with Keynesian economics. Now, the LaGuardia model also, again, like I said, this is not to criticize those who have written about it. It's just that it seems unlikely to me because we don't have an FDR in the White House. We have an individual who admires authoritarian figures globally and from the past, including Benito Mussolini, by the way, who was a fascist. So we don't have an FDR in Washington, nor do we have as a governor that is as friendly to, not anywhere close, to the progressive wing, to Mamdani, for example, as we did in the 1930s. So Mayor LaGuardia in the 1930s had the advantage of a governor and a president who supported what he was doing at the city level. Okay, now that helps a lot. So the question is, what's the prescription for success for Mamdani, who, in my view, unless they do something seriously wrong, he's going to win the election. This is a duly elected individual who won fair and square. Well, clearly, this young man is threatening the neoliberal status quo. And he is reinforcing the idea that it's not New York City. It's the neoliberal institutional structure which benefits the oligarchy, as Senator Bernie Sanders points out, with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez going around the country making these speeches on the floor of the Senate and the Congress, respectively. That's what's in crisis. It's the neoliberal status quo and the oligarchy that it benefits, leaving the rest of society behind. The other problem here is for the Democrats specifically and for Wall Street, can they co-opt Mamdani? The way they co-opt politicians. Co-optation is the cheapest and the most efficient way to have an opposition politician come around, continue to talk the way Bill Clinton and Obama and Biden talked. They talked progressive talk, but of course they were neoliberal politicians wedded to military solutions abroad. Can Mamdani be co-opted? We don't know if he can be co-opted. He could be. I don't know. We'll see. We'll have to wait and see. In my view, the best thing he can do is forge alliances. I noticed recently he had a public meeting. He made a couple of speeches with some trade unionists behind him. He went up to Harlem and tried to get some of the black vote. By the way, black voters stayed with primarily with Cuomo, but they're now slowly turning to Mamdani. Latinos more warmed up to Mamdani than black voters. Although he has received the endorsement of the progressives of the Democratic Party. Mamdani is still an anathema for the establishment Democrats because he exposed just his presence, not him as a person. The young man did, who's, by the way, very charismatic young man. He didn't do anything bad. But what he symbolizes, namely the New Deal wing of the Democratic Party, which goes back, by the way, to Roosevelt and all the way, he was carried during the 72 campaign, George McGovern. And today, of course, Bernie Sanders in the 1980s, I believe, I forget his name. Anyway, someone ran on the Democratic ticket. They quickly discredited him, and he dropped out. Today, Bernie Sanders is carrying the torch, and he's trying to basically prep Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez to carry on. Mamdani is a symbol. He's a symbol of the failure of the oligarchy in America. That's what he symbolizes. He symbolizes the failure of the oligarchy to be faithful to the social contract and to the Constitution of the United States. He's a symbol of the failure of the oligarchy to uphold a modicum of social justice and human rights principles in foreign policy. Let me come, by the way, to the issue of foreign policy. One of the things that he's been criticized about in a city which has 12% of the population, which is Jewish, is that he is anti-Semitic. Okay? He has repeatedly stated that he is in favor of universal human rights, that he is against genocide in Gaza. So is Bernie Sanders. Let me point out, by the way, just dawned on me, with the election of a new pope, there is a cardinal. I will find his name. McElroy is his name. In Washington D.C., he is the archbishop, and the cardinal is actually has embraced some of the exact same positions as Mamdani. No one is saying that the cardinal is a communist, a socialist, an anti-Semite, and yet Cardinal McElroy in Washington, D.C., by the way, in the Catholic hierarchy, is not castigated as a socialist, communist, enemy of the Jews, and all of that. Although, when you look at what he has said, it's not that different for what a Muslim from Indian parents is saying with regard to foreign policy and domestic policy. So why is it that they target this individual other than underlying white supremacist assumptions, and deliberately so for populist appeal to the base of both political parties, by the way, of the conservative wing of the Democratic Party, the establishment wing of the Democratic Party, and the Republican wing? Why don't they lash out at Cardinal McElroy? He is not saying anything much different than what Mamdani is saying. Social justice, human rights, stop the genocide in Gaza, provide humanitarian aid, stop shooting children and unarmed civilians in Gaza trying to get some food in aid centers. Why not stigmatize him? In fact, they hold him up as a good Christian. So here's where you see the underlying racism, but also something else. The cardinal, they figure, well, he is addressing these issues from a religious/moral perspective. Mamdani from a political perspective. Mamdani represents a political threat. the cardinal, keeping it at the religious level, he's not a threat. Because at the moral level, as an individual, yes, I support the cardinal's views. Even if I don't support it, I let him say these things. He has every right. He's a man of the cloth, as we say, a man of God. So we let it go. But not the Muslim who is the about to become mayor of New York City. And what he represents and what they fear, and I want to close with this, what the establishment fears, the Wall Street military industrial complex fear, and the reason they're trying to use everything, they're throwing everything but the kitchen sink at this young man. What they fear is that symbol in New York will spread nationwide. If I was reflecting on this, and if I were among one of the oligarchy, I would actually embrace this young man to save the oligarchy. Just as FDR saved capitalism, this young man's policies are reformers. They're not revolutionaries. If they crush him, especially if they manipulate the election to such a degree as they marginalize or sideline him, or once he is in office, they somehow either co-opt him or demolish him, what will happen is the American population, not just New Yorkers, by the way, the entire American population will become more demoralized that there is no solution. They will become alienated, which is not bad as far as the right wing is concerned, by the way. They want people to be docile and alienated. Eventually, however, as the crisis deepens, and it will deepen because the United States, all metrics show, is not able to reverse the course of its eroding status in the world capitalist economy vis-a-vis China. It's not possible. That's why Trump has caved to China and is playing tough guy with other countries from Canada to Japan and Europe, because there is no leverage the US can use against China. That has proved in the last 6 months, that has been proved. Okay, so what we have here is a situation, if the oligarchy had a bit less of propensity toward greed, a bit more rational approach to public policy, a bit more balanced thinking about how they wanted society to be molded as it's transitioning to playing second fiddle to China eventually in this century, by the way. This is not the American century. This is the Asian century. China and India. As they reflect on that, they would, if they had, again, a modicum of anthropocentric values, human-centered values, which they don't, they would actually embrace this and say, well, let's support him. He's asking for practically nothing. These people, he's asking for 2% taxes, and they just got 4.5 trillion, part of a package. Within that 4.5 trillion, most of that money is going to them, to the rich. And he's saying, can you give 2% so we can have free bus rides, children having free preschool, and raising, by the way, I forgot a very important point, $30 an hour wage in New York City, which, by the way, takes closer to $40 an hour in New York City by 2030, he said, not right now, by the way, in the next 5 years. It takes $40 an hour by 2030. We don't know, it may take $50 an hour just to be above the poverty line. And he's asking for $30. So what we have here is an insane, uncontrollable, greedy oligarchy, which is going to, through its public policy, they're behind the public policy, by the way. John Jay from New York was right. The first Supreme Court justice was right when he said, well, they do control public policy. The rich should control public policy. They do control public policy. But this is self-destructive. This is self-destructive because they will become radicalized, not just New Yorkers. And this is the middle class, by the way. The middle class is the core of any country's democracy, from the French Revolution to the present, from the French Revolution in the 18th century to the present. That's what's the core of liberal democracy. And they're undermining it. And guess what? The middle class in New York went for this person. He's Muslim. He's against Israel's genocide. He wants to tax the rich a little bit more to pay for social programs. He wants to freeze rent, provide more affordable housing in New York. Who doesn't think this is common sense in New York City when you have 1 out of 4 below poverty? The future, obviously, of Mamdani, who is a symbol of the crisis of the institutional structure at the public and private sector levels, is not known. I am not optimistic. I wish I were. As charismatic as he is, he has a beautiful smile, and he comes across as someone who is very charming and so forth. As charismatic as this young man is, I think that the elites, the decadent elites, the oligarchy, as AOC and Bernie Sanders calls them, and others, will prevail over this young man as mayor, assuming he makes it as mayor, as they did with the big, beautiful bill. No matter the cost to society, by the way. The big, beautiful bill will send, as credible economists point out, the public debt skyrocketing. They don't care. They want the money in their pockets. Let the rest of the population pay for it. It will further alienate the majority of the American population, even those who are not learned enough to understand what this bill means for their own lives, because they're blinded by cultural issues and by common biases against migrants, minorities, women, various identity politics groups, by the way. I want to end it there. Thank you very much for watching. Please send questions, comments, write comments, whatever you like. And by all means, please join this channel. And again, thank you for watching. This is the first part. I want to say one last thing. This is the first part of a three-part series. The second part of the American institutional crisis has to do with the American judiciary and the U.S. Department of Justice currently. And the third part has to do with military Keynesianism and U.S. foreign policy, as well as U.S. foreign economic policy, namely economic nationalism and the tariff war. Again, thank you for watching.